While in Australia, our common ground is stable and strong enough to withstand various views. Yet the corporate elites and the political left, they're silencing views which don't fit their narrative on this voice to Parliament proposal. I personally think it's divisive, unnecessary, but like most Australians, I remain concerned it will do nothing to assist Aboriginal peoples, but only feather the nests of the same elites. Big tech, well, it's now joined the bullying over the voice, refusing to allow considered alternative views to be promoted on platforms like Facebook. They believe in free speech, it seems, but only when they're doing the talking. Former Prime Minister Tony Abbott is just one of a range of prominent Australians concerned this corporate bullying is creating divisions that we don't need, and I'm delighted he's joining us tonight. Well, Tony Abbott, Happy New Year to you. In your time as Prime Minister, you showed the way in reconciling differences, finding common ground, sitting amongst Aboriginal communities. They are amongst some of the most vulnerable and marginalised communities in Australia. But a new bureaucratic construct in the Constitution is not going to help them.
Well, thanks, Gary. Happy New Year and happy birthday to you. You're right. As Prime Minister, I tried to spend at least a week a year in remote Australia to get to know the reality of Indigenous people's lives as opposed to simply what you were told by the media and by the bureaucrats. And there's no doubt that there are serious problems in remote Australia, that kids don't go to school as often as they should, adults don't go to work as often as they should, and the ordinary law of the land is not enforced as often as it should be. So there are certainly big problems, but creating another bureaucracy isn't going to help. This idea that yet another meeting in Canberra, yet another bureaucracy in Canberra is somehow going to get the kids to school, the adults to work and the community safe. It's just wrong. It's an exercise in wishful thinking. And my fear is that an abundance of goodwill could lead Australians to vote for something later this year that will turn out to be wrong in principle, bad in practice, but because it's entrenched in our Constitution, it will be almost impossible to reverse. But more than that, my other fear is that the government is trying to create a very unfair environment in which this debate can take place. They're not funding the yes and the no campaign. They are funding what they say will be a campaign against misinformation, and I fear that will end up being yes case propaganda. They have given tax deductibility to donations to the yes case, but not to the no case. I think they're relying on woke public companies to fund the yes case, and they're now relying on big tech to censor the no case. And we've so far had two instances of big tech taking down or demanding significant alterations to material which argues, I think, quite sensibly and intelligently, certainly quite fair-mindedly, the case for voting no. First of all, we had a debate hosted by the Institute of Public Affairs involving Senator Jacinta Price that was, at least for a time, taken down. And now we've got Facebook saying that an Advance Australia ad pointing out that this voice will involve special rights for 3% of the population to influence lawmaking for 100% of the population. That's been forced by big tech to be either withdrawn or changed. Now, it is going to involve special rights for some, but not for all. And I think people should be able to say that. And this idea that big tech isn't just going to be allowed to control what we say, it's going to be empowered to control what we think and the way we vote. I think that's deeply, deeply disturbing.
Well, it is, because I think, like you, I'd like to bring people together. Big tech, big corporations, they may not trust us, but I believe most Australians can actually consider the range of views on this matter sensibly and in good faith. They don't need this protection racket filter of big tech. And younger Australians, though, they may not be as well versed on stuff that's happened in the past as some of the older Australians are. And younger Australians get their views from social media. So I think there's a lot of danger in all of this.
Exactly right, Gary. I mean, this Voice campaign is based on a claim that no one listens to Indigenous people. Well, we've already got 11 individual Indigenous voices in our parliament, including very articulate people on both sides of the fence, such as Jacinta Price on the coalition side and Lydia Thorpe for the Greens, and we've got people like Pat Dodson for the Labor Party. So we've already got lots of Indigenous voices in our public life, including in the parliament. The other thing that's worth saying is for generations, the great campaign was to end discrimination based on race. The famous words of Martin Luther King, "I want my daughters to be judged not by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character." And under this Voice proposal, people will be getting an extra say precisely because of their skin colour or because of their ancestry. Now, I thought it was axiomatic that all Australians were equal. All Australians should have an equal say in the way our parliament and our government works. But under this proposal, people whose ancestry goes back beyond 1788 will be more equal than people who have come since 1788. And I just think that's very concerning in principle. And the government, I think, wants to, on the one hand, tell Indigenous people that this Voice is going to solve all their problems. On the other hand, it wants to tell the rest of us that this Voice is no big deal. But I tell you, anything that changes our constitution is for keeps. It's a forever change. And the worry is that we will end up effectively with two classes of citizens. Some of us who came more recently, who get one vote, and some of us who have ancestry stretching back tens of thousands of years who get two. And I think that's a very, very concerning development.
Now, apparently the grassroots campaign of the Yes campaign, some of it funded by local governments in various parts of Sydney and Melbourne in particular, they're getting people out to go and door knock and do all these sorts of things. So social media is going to then be what it always is, an echo chamber for people. It strikes me there must be a role at the grassroots of society for families to actually mentor their younger generations to realise that principle you're talking about dividing people based on culture, based on race, is in fact going to create a divide that earlier generations of Australians railed against. I've called it political and constitutional apartheid, just like South Africa. We could go down that path if we're not careful. This is the beginning of a very scary leading edge.
I think you're right to be very concerned, Gary. Now, the government wants to say that this is all about being polite, that this is about having goodwill towards Indigenous people. Look, all of us have goodwill. There is an absolute abundance of goodwill towards the first Australians, as there should be. But this is not about recognising Indigenous people in the Constitution. It's about changing the way we governed. It's about entrenching what even Malcolm Turnbull once described as a third chamber of the Parliament into our system, so that everything that government does, everything the Parliament does, has got to be run past this Indigenous body first. Now, obviously, if there's a measure that has a special impact on Indigenous people, you've got to ask Indigenous people what they think and get their advice. But there are an abundance of mechanisms for that happening already. What's clear is that this new body won't just be giving government its views on Indigenous issues, it'll be giving government its views on all issues, because there's a sense in which everything impacts Indigenous people. And as the Prime Minister himself admitted, it would be a very brave, in inverted commas, government that would ignore the Voice's advice. So this is a very, very far-reaching change. It's not something that we should embark upon lightly. It's certainly not something that we should wave through on an abundance of goodwill for Indigenous people, which might turn out to be impossible to reverse if it turns out to be a dreadful mistake. And that's, I fear, exactly what it would be.
Yeah, I mean, I think really Australians are very much so attendant to the definite need of Indigenous Australians in those remote areas, because they are very marginalised. There are all those problems, as you very clearly outlined. The words we use over these next 7 or 8 months are really critical, aren't they? Because division could be caused simply by this debate.
And my fear is that if the voice goes down, it will obviously set back reconciliation. But if the voice gets up, I fear that it's going to leave us a much more divided general Australian community. That's why I think this thing is so fundamentally mistaken. Now, I think we should try to recognise Indigenous people in the Constitution. And personally, I would like to see at the very beginning of our Constitution, after we talk about one indivisible federal Commonwealth, adding something along these lines to create a nation with an Indigenous heritage, a British foundation and an immigrant character, because it's unarguably true. These three elements are important parts of today's Australia, and it's got something for everyone, and it isn't going to make our country more divided, and it isn't going to gum up our government even more. So there are vastly better ways of doing this than the way which the government is currently embarked upon.
Yeah, it seems to me that so much of the Western world has lost its way, and talking about the things that bring us together is a harder task. Government seems to be exhausted by the prospect of that, Tony Abbott. It's very sad. Thank you so much for your time. Your considered words always appreciated, sir. Have a great 2023, my friend.